Hello, YouTube. This is Manny Biel. We are stepping into part 7 of my review and deconstruction of UPB, a book by Stefan Molyneux. Now it's getting to the serious end, I presume. The headline for this chapter is Ethics, so it should prove an interesting read from now on, hopefully. Okay, ethics. Since ethics is a subject that we all have opinions about already, it is important to outline the relationship between instinctual ethics and rational ethics. A baseball player can catch a fly ball even if he knows nothing about physics. It's just a weird way of entering a talk about ethics. The second sentence is a baseball player can catch a fly ball even if you know that's I would say that's not how I will start a discussion about ethics, right? It's just an inference that everybody in the world have opinions about ethics, right? That's something he can't possibly know, right? Because first of all, he does not have access to other people's minds, and secondly, he is just guessing about it, right? Yeah, it may be, reasonable to have that assumption in some way or another, but it's like he's using assumptions and then more or less categorizing them as knowledge, right? So, and then talk about baseball players. And I'm sort of thrown off into, no, let's get to the point. Come on. Okay. A baseball player can catch a fly ball even if he knows nothing about physics. Similarly, we can correctly perceive an action as immoral even if we know nothing about ethical theories. If I can catch a fly ball, then I have an instinctual feel for the behavior of the baseball in flight. My instinctual understanding, however, does not give me the capacity to accurately launch a spaceship to orbit Jupiter. I have an immediate little truth. So now we're back to the little truths again. How the ball will move, but that does not give me a universal great truth. How matter behaves. In the same way, our common moral revulsion towards actions such as rape, murder, are not necessarily inaccurate, but they do not give us capacity to create or validate consistent empirical moral theories. Now, I want to stress once again, rape is not an action. That's an interpretation of an action. And part of that interpretation is that it has some immoral or moral content of some kind. Rape and murder. Rape is a kind of sex. Murder is a kind of ending someone's life. So, yes, if it is rape and it is murder, okay, I would say probably people will revulse, but you have still not pointed out how you arrive at that immoral part or that immoral attribute of those specific actions. And those moral things are, by your own definitions, something you add yourself. You can't experience it, right? You accept Hume's is-ought distinction, right? You just said that in ground rule 1. So now you're bringing in that sort of half-baked moral content without even potentially understanding that that's what you're doing. So if morality was that easy, just say rape and murder and then fix things, then why read that? Why write that whole book? If I propose a scientific theory that completely invalidates a baseball player's ability to catch a fly ball, then I have the insurmountable challenge of explaining how the baseball player actually does catch the ball. Also, if my grand theory cannot accurately predict the arc of a fly ball, then I have a great truth, which directly contradicts a little truth, which cannot be valid. Okay, Since the necessity of logical consistency directly arises from the little truths of perceptual experience, any theory that directly contradicts such experience cannot be valid. Now, I was confused about that definition in the last part about truth, and now he brings back the little and the great truth, which I thought he had discarded. What about those definitions we just had? What about those? Are they the same as these little? I mean, I don't know what to say. I don't have a word for it. It's just weird. In other words, the senses give rise to logic. Therefore, logic cannot contradict the evidence of the senses. Evidence always trumps explanation. Let's see. In other words, the senses give rise to logic. Well, yes, I would agree with that, because the sense data, or what I would call the attribute, let's take the elephant, is that the elephant is gray because I experience it, or I can see whenever I experience elephant, it tends to be gray. So if elephants are gray, if this is an elephant, it must be gray. That's the logic of it, right? So it arises from the attributes of those objects, in this case, an elephant. Therefore, logic cannot contradict the evidence of the senses. No, but logic is an expressed, it's a derivative that about your experience that says that the parts of the thing has to be there for the thing to be the thing, right? So logic is a kind of derivative of your experience, sort of a description of how your experience is that shouldn't be. You can't say that an elephant doesn't have a color, for instance, right? That would be illogical. That doesn't fit the logic of your experience. But logic doesn't exist in that sense. It's just a way of attempting to connect attributes with the concept, so to say. This is quite difficult to explain, in my opinion, so I'm trying my best. So they cannot contradict the evidence. No, but it's because logic is it's first the experience, then logic. So if logic is dependent on your experience, it can't contradict it, then it's an incorrect logic of some kind. Evidence always trumps explanation. Yes, evidence. If evidence is, you say elephant, is that evidence? I don't like to call it evidence, I like to call it knowledge. But if we say it's the same thing, it trumps explanation, I would give you absolutely. In a similar manner, any valid ethical theory should be able to explain and justify our common revulsion towards crimes such as murder. Crime? How do you know that's a crime? You haven't explained the immorality of murder. Now you call it a crime? As if that's something you experience. You don't experience crime. Right? You don't experience the crimeness of things. So this hand moves, has a knife that moves this, and this knife's tip enters this chest of another person, and then it keeps on breathing, and then some blood, and then stops breathing. And where is the murder thing? Where is the immorality? Point to it. Where is it? It has to be experienced in order for you to use a term like murder and say that's experienced. Otherwise, you are pretending that it is experiential while it isn't. That would be, then you would be sort of cheating. And now they're calling it a crime. That's another kind of interpretation, right? And the crimes is sort of an appeal to an authority. Because this is a crime, it's against the law, right? Don't talk about crimes if you haven't even pointed out what is immoral about the murder. This is not legality or, lawmaking. This is ethics, right? It cannot reasonably contradict the universal prohibitions of mankind. The universal prohibitions. What are those? Is a reference to these 4 moral premises: rape, theft, assault, and murder. Are they prohibited? Yes, it prohibits it, given that you can identify it. But people identifying murder left or right as they see fit is not an argument in ethics. You have to explain Hume's Isord gap. You are constantly violating that which you have sworn to uphold. So this is bullshit. You don't know what you're talking about. However, just as Einsteinian physics provided surprising truths, in fact, it would have been of little value if those truths were not surprising. I see where you're going. If you are having a new theory of gravity and it just ends up saying, well, Newton was right, I guess that's not really a new theory. I understand where you're going. Shocking ethical theory provide the most value when they also reveal surprising truths. No. Ethical theories do not reveal truths. I mean, what are you saying? You are conflating the ideas of truth here, right? Truth is a result of a proposition, right? It's not something that ethics reveals. Shocking, even. In fact, ethical theories that did not provide surprising truths would be a mere confirmation of existing instinctual preferences and thus be of little value. Okay, but you are not referring to any other philosopher in history who has tried to find a moral principle. The most glaring example is, the categorical imperative by Immanuel Kant. But there are potentially others in history who has tried to universalize, to use your term, a principle that could be used to judge your actions and so on. I mean, the Bible, of course, but that's BS, right? But why do you pretend that there's only people's all these subjective ideas about murder and so on and morality? What about all these philosophers who have made attempts, at least at some kind of? Spinoza has done something also. I haven't read his ethics, but it's on the to-do list, a bit down on the list. So why not refer to them also? Like, this is what Kant said, and I think he was maybe a bit wrong because this and that and the other. Okay, maybe it will pop up later. Okay, next chapter is the discipline of theoretical ethics. If I say, I'll take a sip of my drug. If I say something is morally good, in other words, if I propose an ethical theory is not something you propose. You propose knowledge. Ethical theories are not true or false. They are correct or incorrect, according to some kind of ethics or philosophy. Then clearly I am arguing that human beings should act in a particular manner or avoid acting in a particular manner. I guess if I tell my son that he should become a baseball player just because I want him to, I am not stating a universal moral premise, but rather personal preference. He's not moral if he becomes a baseball player, neither is he immoral. Now you need to define what you mean by being moral or immoral, right? You need to define what that is. You are constantly using its term, pointing to objects and say, this can be this morality or ought not. What is it? What color does it have? What taste does it have? It is a rational ethics, right? A rational proof. It has to do with sort of, empiricism, right? However, if I tell him that it is moral for sons to obey their fathers and immoral for them to disobey their fathers, then I'm proposing a preference that is universal rather than merely personal. yeah, you are claiming some kind of universality. That doesn't mean it is like that. And now you're using preference again without, you prefer that. I'm not sure that you just can slap that preference on it. I'm trying to turn a little truth. I want to become a good baseball player into a great truth. It is immoral for sons to disobey fathers. Yeah, I see where you're going. Yeah. If he wishes to be moral, he must become a baseball player. Not because becoming a baseball player is moral, but rather because obeying his father is moral. I see, but that's manipulation, right? He's not trying to get to an objectivity. He's trying to manipulate his son into doing what he wants. When I speak of a universal preference, I'm really, and that's another point, that is morality is usually used to manipulate people, right? It's not, it should be based in objectivity, in my opinion. That's why, so it's fixed to something that is independent of each person, or at least it's independent of the person participating in that particular objectivity. So it doesn't matter if somebody wants something. If somebody else says, I don't want it, then fuck you, right? When I speak of a universal preference, I'm really defining what is objectively required or necessary, assuming a particular goal. If I want to live, I do not have to like jazz, but I must eat. Yes, I do not have to like, no, I do not have to like jazz. No, but it helps. If I want to live, but I must eat. I must eat. If I want to live, I must eat. Yeah. Let's eat that. Eating remains a preference. No, it's not a preference. No, it's a necessity. It's not a preference. It's not, oh, I prefer to eat because I need to eat, right? No, please, that preference thing is, lurking in the corner, waiting to jump in and put itself on something, right? I do not have to eat in the same way that I have to obey gravity. No, you don't obey gravity. Gravity is, throwing you around in the ring as it see fits, right? But eating is a universal objective. It's not objective. Eating is an interpretation. An object is a sandwich, for instance, right? But a sandwich is not eating. So eating is not, I don't know about that universal. I don't know why that needs to be said. Is it universal for all living things? Do you have to be able to eat everywhere in the universe? It's like he has this universal and preference, and he, as soon as he thinks he can, throw these universal preference in, then at some point people will say, okay, I guess it's a universally preferable behavior, and then he has proven something, right? But throwing in words doesn't prove anything, basically, right? We have to agree upon what you're talking about. And eating is a universal, objective, and binding requirement for staying alive. Binding. So it's binding because if I don't eat, I will die. Or if I don't eat, I won't live. So there's a binding between me and eating. Requirement for staying alive, since it relies on biological facts that cannot be wished away. I guess it feels manipulative, in my opinion. Ethics as a discipline can be defined as any theory regarding preferable human behavior. That is universal, objective, consistent, and binding. So you define ethics as universally preferable behavior. And then you talk about things that these are universal preferable behavior, and therefore they are ethics, and therefore, so you're using words to connect the things together, right? Just calling them things that match the title of the book or what you define as ethics, regarding preferable human behavior. Let's see. Naturally, preferential behavior can only be binding if the goal is desired. The goal is desired. Now we are talking, I think it's the first time I heard the term desire. So and goal, now goal is also the first time we hear the word goal. Preferential behavior can only be binding if the goal is desired. But what if I don't desire to eat? So it's no longer binding. If I say that it is preferable for human beings to exercise and eat well, I am not saying that human beings must not sit on the couch and eat potato chips. What I'm saying is that if you want to be healthy, you should exercise or eat well. Or you ought to. You should. There's a demand. Yeah? If you want to, why is there only one solution? And there you're also, you're piling exercise and eating together. So can you add more? Exercise, eat, jump, bicycle, have sex, whatever. Can you just add a number? If you want to be healthy, you should. So there's not necessarily only one solution to a hypothetical imperative, as Kant would call it. You are directly saying here that you can have two answers to one. If then you should exercise and eat well. It could obviously exercise, eat. You just add, right? Is two the limit? Or if you in the future have an if then, and you only have one thing after the then, can I just add a number of extra thens, if I please? Can you rule that out? You're not telling me if it's possible or not. As Hume famously pointed out, it is impossible to derive an ought from an is. No, he didn't point that out. You have misread his quote. He didn't say that. He neither said that you can or can't. He's only said that you have to point out how you do it. And since you keep doing it, you are still missing to point out how you do it. What he meant by that was that preference. Oh, you're sneaking preference into Hume? In no way can be axiomatically derived from existence. Now it's the first time I think we see the word axiom. Axiomatically derived from existence. Preference cannot be axiomatically derived from existence. So what is preference then derived from? You're saying that you're implicating that it's being derived from something. So if it's not derived from existence, is it derived from your emotions or your ideas or what? I'm not sure. It is true that a man who never exercises and eats poorly will be unhealthy. Does that mean that he ought to exercise and eat well? No, the ought is conditional upon the preference. No. This is important. You do not understand what Hume is talking about when he's not referring exactly to the word ought and how that word ought is being used in other contexts than moral, right? It's not that it's not an if-then reference he has. He is referencing to moral judgments that goes from is to ought. It's his sort of 1700s version of describing morality in a more sort of low practical way. It's not about if this is the case, you ought to exercise, right? You're misrepresenting the idea Hume is talking about. He wants to point out that you can't go from, this is how the world is, and therefore you ought to behave, or you ought to behave in a word that create a different kind of combination of things than the is on the other side would point to otherwise, right? So you are misusing the term ought, in my opinion. If he was to be healthy, he ought to exercise and eat well. Still, that's not what Hume is saying. It is true that if a man does not eat, he will die. Yeah, but dying is not something true. Right? True is a reference to an object. Dying is not an object. We cannot logically derive from that fact a binding principle that he ought to eat. Binding principle? Now principles can be binding. Is that a new way of putting it? I'm not sure. If he wants to live, then he must eat. However, his choice to live or not remains his own. Okay. Similarly, there is no such thing as universally better direction. It all depends upon the preferred destination. If I want to drive to New York from San Francisco, I ought to drive east. Not necessarily. It depends on how you want to get to New York from San Francisco. If I want to drive into the ocean from San Francisco, I ought to drive. No, it's not ought. You are trying to conflate the word ought with a hypothetical, right? Ought has the connotations of morality, not if you want this, then you should do this. Then you have exchanged with ought, and then you think you are discussing ought in a ethical-less or moral-less or morally devoid situation, and then bringing ought in, right? It's sort of a linguistic manipulation of some kind, I feel, at least. Neither East nor West can be considered universally better. But that's this universally again. It is true that very few people do drive into the ocean, but that does not mean that it is universally true that nobody ought to drive into the ocean. Principles are not democratic, or if they are, we once more face the problem of rank subjectivism. Now there's the subjectivism again. Is that the problem of subjectivism? Rank subjectivism, ooh, that sounds bad. And must throw the entire concept of ethics out the window. There are some dots here. I can't. It's like, we are everywhere at the same time, and I can't, follow the dots that you're potentially trying to connect. Behavior exists in objective reality outside our minds. The concepts ought, should, and preference do not exist outside our minds. No. Behavior doesn't exist. And there's no such thing as objective reality. All realities are subjective because they have to be experienced by someone, right? You have to experience. If there are no people to experience, there wouldn't be a reality. There would be something outside our reality which we do not have access to, but our reality is not inside our mind, right? If reality is inside your mind and you have access to that, I am inside your mind. You are actually the whole universe. You are the universe. It doesn't work, right? You have to admit that all you have is your subjective experience, and then you can agree with somebody else on some objectivity around certain objects. There is no external objective reality you can tap into. And a behavior is not objective because it's not an object. A behavior is a certain set of actions, a certain type of actions, which have the same purpose in common, like eating. But there's no way as eating could be called a behavior, right? Because it's the same purpose, survival, or getting fat, or whatever you want to say the purpose is. But it doesn't say anything about where or who or what is being eaten. It's still the same behavior, but it can be vastly different kinds of actions with each different kind of objects. So it can't be objective. It can be almost anything you want, right? as long as the same result is there. It's completely nonsense. And that existence outside our minds, the way you say the concept ought, should, and preference do not exist outside our minds, is implicitly saying that some things exist outside our minds. Now, that reality outside our minds, how the hell do you know that it's there, and how do you know what it's made of, and how what it is like? Exactly because it's outside your mind. It's crazy. It's crazy talk. If it's outside your mind, you will have no access to it. It must be inside your mind somehow if you can relate to it. There's no mind outside your mind that is connected to your mind so you know what that outside thing is. This is metaphysics, and it's a pile of garbage, actually. It doesn't work, right? However, the fact that ought does not exist within objective reality does not mean that ought is completely subjective. I'm not sure about that. Neither the scientific method nor numbers themselves exist within reality either. Yet science and mathematics remain objective disciplines. No, they're not objects. They're systems. They are conventions. You can do something correct according to your mathematics, right? You just talked about these engineers creating a bridge. There are no objects there, not in relation to that bridge at least, right? The objects are there. They are pencils or computers or paper, but those are not the objects of the bridge. So you are making mathematics in order to describe something in the future, right? So it's not objective because it's not an object. Not in relation to that thing you're working towards. So the thing you're doing is not an object, right? It's not an object. You can be correct or incorrect according to that system. If you are, using arithmetic, there's certain rules in arithmetic that you follow, right? That has been established and proved and so on. So if you don't follow them, you are not doing it correctly. But it has nothing to do with objectivity. You are misunderstanding the idea of objectivity. So there are so many things wrong here. It's some groundbreaking problems that at this point I'm in the camp of I don't really care what the final result will be of this endeavor you have going in this book, right? I will reject it because there's so many flaws in your thinking already that it cannot possibly be true. It's not internally consistent. It's not working, right? According to your own rules, this should be rejected already at this point, in my opinion. But let's carry on. Self-defeating arguments. In order to begin our discussion of ethics, it is essential that we understand the nature of self-defeating arguments. In economics, a theory cannot be valid if it requires that prices go up and down at the same time. In physics, a theory cannot be valid if it requires that gases expand and contract simultaneously. In mathematics, a theory cannot be valid if it requires 2 plus 2 equals 5, since 5 is just another way of describing 2 plus 3, not 2 plus 2. And so to say 2 plus 2 equals 5 is to say that 5 equals 4, which is self-contradictory. Well, yeah, I suppose you're right. In general, any theory that contradicts itself in the utterance cannot be valid. No, that's internal consistency, I would think, right? It does not require external disproof, since it disproves itself. We do not need to examine every nook and cranny in the universe to determine that a square circle does not exist. The very concept is self-contradictory and thus disprove itself in the utterance. No. No, there's no need to look for square circles for a very simple reason. Neither square or circle exist, right? Squares are ideas in your head. Circles are ideas in your head. So square circles must be ideas in your head. So there's no need to look, right? And also it sounds contradictory. It sounds impossible. As you yourself said, it's self-detonating argument, self-defeating. So the very concept is self-contradictory and thus the proof is self-inutterance. If I submit a complex mathematical proof to you and you notice that at the very beginning, I state that the proof relies on the fact that 2 + 2 makes 4 and 5 at the same time, you do not need to read any further. Similar as mentioned before, if I come up to you and say, I do not exist, my thesis automatically self-destructs. If I am communicate to you that I do not exist, that is clearly I exist. No, I don't want to go into the metaphysics of that. Let's just keep that. If I come up to you and say there's no such thing as truth, then I am making a statement that I consider to be true, claiming that truth does not exist. Again, my argument self-destruct. No, but truth, whether something is true, is particular to you as a person. If you experience elephant and somebody makes a proposition that says that's an elephant, it's true to you only, right? If you say it's true, those who are listening to you cannot know if you experience that elephant. I've said this several times, right? So it's true is only truth of a proposition is only to the subject that presents that affirmation, that true, right? It's only the person who says it's true that can check whether or not it's true. Who knows if it's a lie or if it's really false? So if there's no such thing as truth, well, what do you mean? Truth is not a thing. Truth is not a thing. It's an affirmation. It isn't a thing. You're making a statement about a thing. So can it be true that no such thing as truth exists? No, it can't. In that sense, it's a self-defeating, self-destructing argument. But it's very fluffy way of, I mean, there's so much insecurity or things that points in other direction. It feels very like you're just, I'm grabbing this and this sounds like it could be used, and I'm grabbing that, it sounds like it could be used, and everything will point. I'm trying to connect the dots so I end up in that situation where I need to go, because that's where I've decided my ethics needs to go. It's like you're collecting or creating that evidence you need to get where you need to go. It feels like it. You're connecting the dots your own way. If I tell you that language is meaningless, then I have contradicted myself in order for me to verbally communicate that language is meaningless. Language must have at least some meaning. If I tell you that senses are invalid, then my argument also self-destructs, since I am using your sense of hearing to communicate to you that your sense of hearing is invalid. If I can successfully communicate my thesis to you, then your sense of hearing must be valid. I guess, yeah, sure. Preferences. Now that we understand the nature of self-defeating arguments, we can turn to the question of preference. Preferences are central to any methodology claiming to define the truth value of propositions. Preferences are central to any methodology. This is important. Preferences are, I'm going to keep that one. The scientific method, for instance, is largely defined by innate preferences for logical consistency and empirical verification. For science, the premise is if you want to determine a valid truth about the behavior of matter and energy, it is preferable to use the scientific. You're sneaking in that word preferable, right? It's just like, oh yeah, I'm attaching preferable here and preferable there and preferable there. And you see that's preferable everywhere. So I guess I'm right because universally preferable behavior. In this sense, preferable does not mean sort of better, but rather required. If you want to live, it is universally preferable that you refrain from eating a handful of arsenic. But that's a positive combined with a negative. Now, if I want to live, I don't care about arsenic, right? Living is a positive. To live, I need to eat, right? If I can keep avoiding arsenic all my life and still die, right? It's not going to help my life that I eat it, but avoiding arsenic is not going to keep me alive. So it's kind of BS argument, right? If you wish to determine valid truths about reality, it is universally preferable that your theories be both internally consistent and empirically verifiable. Universally preferable then translates to objectively required. These kinds of, it's like it's a sort of circle jerk of your own terms, universally preferable behavior, and then you're sort of bringing in Hume and mixing it all up, and then all of a sudden, if I'm not mistaken, in some time in the near future, you will say, and therefore universally preferable behavior, because you've used these terms so many times, so now it becomes the case. And objectivity thrown in and so on, right? Similarly, if ethical theories can be at all valid, then they must at least be both internally and externally consistent. In other words, an ethical theory that contradicts itself cannot be valid. Well, no. And an ethical theory that contradicts empirical evidence and near universal preferences. What about what is near? That's a weasel word again. Well, what am I sitting in something that is not universal? Could I be in that other part, that other section that is not near universal? Can also be valid. Thus, in ethics, just as in science, mathematics, engineering, and all other disciplines that compare theories to reality, no, you don't make a theory and compare it to reality. I know that maybe you're trying to say something else. You look at reality and how it changes, and then you look at the things that are bouncing into each other and say, when this is the case, this is how it's going to behave, right? You're not making a theory and then go out and see how it compares to reality. Just to put that, in context. Valid theories must be both logically consistent and empirically verifiable. Okay. Let's see how much it preferences and existence. If I say I like ice cream, only one word remains ambiguous in that sentence. Clearly, I exist since I am expressing a preference. Equally clearly, ice cream also exists in reality. How do you know if there's no ice cream? You're just saying ice cream and pretending that there is ice cream. Okay, but if let's say you have ice cream, then you have ice cream. However, the word like is more problematic. Well, yeah, it is, because you're trying to, equate like with preference. Preferences do not exist objectively within reality. If you were obsessively curious, you could perhaps follow me around and record every time I ate ice cream, which would probably provide a good empirical basis for establishing my preference for it. The possibility could exist, however, that I am in fact a masochist and dislike ice cream intensely and prefer to torture myself with its unpleasant taste and then confuse you by claiming to like it. Well, yeah, sure. Absolutely. That's what I've been pointing out a lot of times, right? We can find evidence for preferences. We cannot find preference itself in reality. No, but evidence is not knowledge. We need to keep that in mind, right? Preference exists as a relationship between consciousness and matter, just as preference exists as a relationship. Now there's a relationship. Is that not the first time you've seen relationship? I'm not sure. Relationship exists. You just said we can't find evidence for preference. So evidence, no, preference doesn't exist. And now you're saying preference exists as a relationship. But using exist in that is a very misleading choice of words. You just said that preference doesn't exist objectively. Does it? So it exists subjectively or what? Right? Between consciousness and matter. But matter is a part of consciousness. It must be. Right? You experience matter. It's a representation of something outside your mind. You don't know what it is outside your mind, but the matter, whatever it is you're referring to, must be in your mind. Otherwise, you couldn't talk about it, right? So it's a relationship between one thing in your mind and, or consciousness is actually your whole mind, or what? Or part of it. I would say it's a part of it. And then matter is something else that you're conscious of that matter. So there's a relationship between two parts of your mind in this way. Just as gravity exists as a relationship between bodies of mass. Yeah, well, gravity is an effect of space being bent. Is the best sort of explanation so far in Einsteinian physics, right? It's not a relation between the bodies of mass. It's that the bodies of mass create distortions in space that if some other mass comes passing by, it will be pressed against, they will be pressed against each other because of this distortion. Okay. Putting aside the challenging questions of free will versus determinism, it is reasonable to assume that whatever a person is doing in the present is what he or she prefers to do. If I get up and go to work, then obviously I prefer to do that as opposed to all other alternatives. Even if I hate my job, I clearly hate it less than, say, being penniless, I guess. But you can like several things and still do another thing, right? That the preference is not something that cut out in. You're saying that whenever I do something, I'm not doing something else, so I prefer to do that compared to all the other things I could do, right? In a sort of free will scenario. But no matter what I do, I'm never doing any of the other things I'm never doing. So I'm always preferring something. So you are always in a state of preference. So you can't use preference as an argument because you always prefer. I'm preferring this to an infinity of other things I could be doing, right? So it's a consequence of the thinking of free will that you could have done other things. And therefore, because you could have done other things, you prefer to do this. But no matter what you do, right? No matter what you do, there's always a lot of other things you could have done. That doesn't mean you're preferring, you're always in a state of preference then, right? And then you're trying to use that as sort of a choice of preference, right? You're choosing to prefer it while I have to prefer something, right? It's baked in the cake, so to say. Every time I do something, it's a kind of preference. So I'm always preferring, right? So there are no cases where I'm never preferring something. So you're just adding another word called prefer to I always do something, right? So it's not particular to anything we do because we are always preferring. Given that human beings can perform a near infinity variety of actions, whatever a person is doing in the moment is chosen out of all the other possible options. I am choosing to write this book rather than say, yes, but you can always say that, as I pointed out before, right? You're always in a state of preference, according to your term preference. When we apply this simple fact to the ethical arguments, we come up with some very interesting results. Oh, so we are an what's they call an inversion of poisoning the well. We are, sweetening the well. Preferences and arguments. Remembering our above analysis of self-defeating arguments, we can easily understand the contradictory nature of the statement, preferences do not exist. Given that every human action, including making philosophical statements, is chosen in preference to every other possible actions, arguing that preferences do not exist requires a preference for arguing that preferences do not exist. No, human beings are always in a state of preference in your determination of preference. So you can't say that they could have done otherwise, but if they had done that other thing, then other things would have been could have been possible, right? There's always something else that could be possible. So I understand that you say, okay, if you could have preferred something else that could have been had another kind of moral situation, then you could choose that. But isn't that just saying you have free will? Right? Is preference not just another indication of free will then? Why do you need to call it preference? Is it because that word is a part of the title of the book? How far did I get? Remembering our above analysis of self-defeating arguments, we can easily understand the contradictory nature of the statement, preferences do not exist. They don't exist because they are not objects. Why is it contradictory? You just said they don't exist. Up here, you said preferences do not exist objectively within reality. Am I missing something? Given that every human action, including making philosophical statements, is chosen in preference to other possible action, arguing that preferences do not exist requires a preference for arguing that preferences do not exist, which is Holy fuck, man. Let's try that again. Given that every human action, including making philosophical statements, is chosen in preference to every other possible action, arguing that preferences do not exist requires a preference for arguing that preferences do not exist, which is it is one of those there where your head starts to spin and you say, I'm going to fucking throw this out the window. I can't handle this. I have to say you're trying to manipulate me because it's so convoluted, right? Arguing that preferences do not exist exactly the same as arguing that language does not exist. It is an utterly self-defeating argument. But preferences do not exist. You just said it. What the hell? They're not a part of existence. Since it is impossible to act without expressing a preference, either implicitly or explicitly, anyone who acts accepts the premise that preferences exist. But you have told me they don't exist. Up here, preferences do not exist objectively within reality. Then where the hell are they? What are you saying? How far did I get? Okay, the preferences and universality. The next question thus becomes, are preferences purely subjective or can they be universal? Okay, so he was actually saying that they can't exist. So now I'm confused. Are they subjective or can they be universal? No, why is there another category now? You have subjectivity and objectivity. What's that third category called? Universal. What is that? Why don't you explain yourself? You need to define what you mean. You can't just add another category and say, oh, I add another category. What the hell are you doing? Clearly, some preferences are subjective. Preferences are, if it's a preference, it's not an object. So it must be some subjective thing. So it's an emotion or an idea or something. So it's by default, it's subjective. Every one of them, right? Musical tastes, personal hobbies, favorite literature, and so on, all subjective and personal preference. The challenge arises when we try to define some preferences as objective. Yes, I would say that's a big problem because they are purely subjective. They can never be objective. You can't have a preference that had a sound or a taste and so on, right? So if they don't have that, they can't be objective. When I say that some preferences may be objective, I do not mean that all people follow these preferences all the time. If I were to argue that breathing is an objective preference, I could be easily countered by the example of those who commit suicide by hanging themselves. If I were to argue that eating is an objective preference, my arguments could be countered with hunger strikes and anorexia. Again, preferences are not objective. They are by definition not objective because they are no object. So they can't be observed as an objective thing. You can't make a proposition, preference, true or false, right? You can't, it's not an object. Okay, thus when I talk about universal preferences, I am talking about what people should prefer, not what they always do prefer. Who are you to tell people what to prefer? So now you're going around telling people what to prefer. Shut the F up, man. To use a scientific analogy, to truly understand the universe, people should use the scientific method. Well, why do you care? If people don't want to use a scientific method and you do, then avoid them. Don't go around telling people what to do. Who do you think you are? This does not mean that they always do so, since clearly billions of people consult ancient fairy tales rather than modern science for answers. Yeah, so be it. But I want to have the ability to say no thank you to have anything with people who, consult fairy tales rather than doing a scientific method if we are going to build a bridge that I'm, participating in paying for or something like that, right? It's more like, I don't want to tell everybody what they should think or do. I want to say, I want to be able to avoid these people who are doing things a way I don't like and that I think is not objective, right? There is no way to achieve truth about the universe without science, but people are perfectly free to redefine truth as error and content themselves with mystical nonsense. Well, yeah, sure. Likewise, if a man wants to cure an infection, he should take antibiotics rather than perform an Aztec rain dance. Why do you care? He shouldn't do it. There's nothing he should do. Stay away with your commandments, right? The preference for taking antibiotics rather than doing a rain dance is universal, since dancing cannot cure infections. Thus, although there is the occasional madman who will try to cure himself through dancing, it is still universally preferable that if a man wants to cure himself. No, it isn't. You shouldn't go around telling people what to do. What you should be able to do is avoid people who wants to do something that you think is detrimental to your life, right? If they want to rain dance all they want down there because they think they're curing themselves, so be it, right? Let them do it, right? So everybody else can see how stupid it is, right? Don't go around and tell them it's universally preferable that you take antibiotics now, right? And another thing is, whose antibiotics is it? Is it yours? Is it mine? Is it their own? Where does it lay on the ground? What about that? In other words, if you want to go to the top of a mountain, wishing for it will never work. If you want to know the origins of the universe, prayer will not provide the answer. Okay. But so what? There's no binding anywhere, right? You are so hung up on that. Oh, but I'll have to say you should do this, right? You want so badly to say this is the case, this is the case, this is the case, therefore you should do. You are so tempted to just jump the Izzard gap by Hume. Right? He was a freaking smart guy. You can't just do it like that. You have to explain how. And the explanation you're providing here is just rearranging words to sound like you are cooking us some new stuff called universally preferable behavior. But you're not saying anything new. It's just, the old words. You want to tell people what to do, and they have free will, and therefore there are different kind of choices, and so on, right? With that in mind, let us turn to the question of whether or not universal preference can be valid. Okay, so arguments and universality. Let us take a break here and save that for the next part. Maybe I'll do a notes on this, but I'm starting to feel that it's simply too complicated for me to keep, track of definitions. I have to, when I find something I find very important, I will keep that, but there are simply too many threads to keep trace of that I'm simply lost my overview. So I'll have to keep things more simple if I want, otherwise my brain would explode, right? So let's stick to arguments and universality in the next part, and then say, well, see you next time. And remember to, like, subscribe, and click the bell, and comment, and so on. And check out the Discord link in the description. And otherwise, have a nice day.